We're going to turn this morning in God's Word to the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. Exodus chapter 23, and I'll be looking this morning at verses 14 to 17 especially, but the reading has a couple more verses for context. Just to give a little bit of introduction this morning, we're in a series that's looking at the church. And we said last week that part of our being a part of the church is discovering the wonder again of what God is doing here. Having our imaginations open to see that God works through communities. He doesn't just give us a philosophy to follow, but he calls us into community with each other and therefore with him. And one of the ways that is most visible, and we're going to talk about this morning, is communal worship. Now, I realize that this is in some ways sort of an odd sermon to preach, because if you're here every single week, you're kind of going to nod your head and say, okay, well, yeah, we got that. We're here and we do that, and good for us. And maybe you even feel a little self-righteous, which is not really what God would have us do, but it's sort of a natural tendency. Or on the other end, if you're not here very often, maybe you feel a little tinge of guilt, and you're like, oh, I don't know, he's talking to me. He's got it in for me. That's why he's preaching the sermon, and that's not really the point either. So my hope this morning is that God would invite all of us, whether we're here occasionally or we're here often, to think something more about what is it that's going on in this place, in this space when we gather as his people. And what would he have us learn? What would he have us grow into? What invitations is God giving us as we think about being his people in worship together? Before we turn to the word, let's take just a moment to ask God's blessing in a moment of prayer this morning. God of grace and glory, you call us with your voice of flame to be your people, faithful and courageous. As your beloved Son embraced his mission in the waters of baptism, inspire us with your Spirit to join in his transforming work. Holy Spirit, speak this word into our hearts this morning, that we would understand what it is you want us to hear and how it is that you want us to respond. We pray these things for the glory of Jesus Christ. Amen. Exodus 23, I'm actually going to start at verse 12, and then we'll start the focus will be starting in verse 14 with the three feasts. 6 days do your work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your house and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. And here especially is our text this morning. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Aviv, for in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. Celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your crops from the field. 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends of Jesus, how often do you need to go to church in order to be a good member of God's people? Now, I know that I'm talking to a lot of you who are in an older generation here, and you're scratching your heads and going, what kind of a question is that? I mean, you were raised, many of you, at a time and a place when it was unthinkable that you wouldn't be in a place like this on a Sunday morning. If you were part of the Christian Reformed Church like I was, the debate was not whether or not you would be in church on Sunday, but whether or not you were going to be there twice. Some of you know how this goes, right? Being in church, worshiping together was simply assumed. It was something that you did. It was expected. And few people who considered themselves a Christian, or serious Christian anyhow, few people would think of missing corporate worship. Well, I don't have to tell you that in recent years it's shifted dramatically. I've heard it said in a number of places that people who think of themselves as very committed to the church are there maybe twice a month, 2 Sundays a month. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Some of it is the busyness of life. Some of it is things like the pandemic that sort of scared us away from large corporate settings as a culture in some ways. Some of it is a shift in thinking about the church. We've become quite aware, I think, of the fact that it can be possible to insulate ourselves within these four walls, and so there's trends now to kind of push ourselves beyond the walls of the church. That's good overall, isn't it? We say churches should be out there in the community, not stuck in a building. But in the process, even for members of the church, often what happens here is downplayed as sort of boring or irrelevant or maybe unnecessary to living a good life, which many hold is really the point of being a Christian. But is that really all that this is about? Is that really all that the Christian faith is about? How often do you need to go to church to be a good disciple of Jesus? Well, I want to start this morning by acknowledging that the Bible does not give us a specific answer to that question. So if you were hoping to walk out of here saying, well, you know what, I'm fine because I went to church so many times last year, therefore I'm okay. Or if you want to go out of church feeling mad at me because the pastor said I needed to go more, you were not going to get that kind of a specific answer. Old Testament worship, as we'll see today, was very different from what we see in the New Testament church. And even in the New Testament, there's only passing clues about what worship looked like in the early church. You can read some of those things, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and chapter 14. We can read kind of a glimpse of a church service in Acts 20, where the pastor talked too long, it seems, perhaps, and somebody fell out of a window, fell asleep. And it's true that there are many people around us who are good people, who never darken the door of a church. Maybe sometimes they're people that we like and care about very much. Maybe we even feel more connected to them sometimes than we do to the people that we worship with each Sunday. It's unfortunate, but it's true. But I also think that God in His Word invites us to see some things about corporate worship that help us understand that it is indeed a crucial part of the life of His people. Just the other day, I read, not on purpose, but in my devotions, my personal devotions, I was going through the assigned readings for that day, and I came across Hebrews 10 that talks about how we should not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. Well, there's a reason that a verse like that is in Scripture. And the question that we want to try to uncover this morning is why? What is it that's unique or that's special about this time that we spend in this place each week? Not just to challenge people, maybe challenge ourselves to be here, to get here into the building, but to say, what is it that we should be looking for or expecting when we come to worship? So how often do you need to go to church to be a faithful follower of the one true God? Well, in the Old Testament people of God, a basic expectation was that the entire community, or at least the male heads of households, would gather 3 times a year. You could go more than that, certainly, go to worship more than that, but you would gather at least 3 times a year before God at the place of worship. These are pilgrim feasts. It's clear that even though the males were required to go, often the women and children would go along too. We can think about the story of Hannah and Samuel, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Or the story of Jesus and his family when he was 12 years old going to the temple in Luke chapter 2. 3 feasts, 3 community celebrations of God's work among His people. These are woven into the fabric of Israel's national life, religious life. The first one mentioned in verse 15 is a feast of unleavened bread. It's more commonly known as Passover. Passover was a feast that happened in the spring. It recalled God's deliverance of His people from Egypt when God had passed over the firstborn male children of Israel, when He had slain all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians in the last plague. And He passed over them because of the blood that was on the doorpost of the Israelite homes. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 12 and 13. The next feast, the Feast of Harvest, in verse 16, is also called Pentecost. It's a late spring feast. It marked the beginning of the grain harvest and God's provision of food for another year. You want to read a little bit more about how they celebrated it, you can go to Leviticus chapter 23. That chapter has sections on a number of the feasts. The Feast of Ingathering, elsewhere called the Feast of Tabernacles, coincided with the fall fruit harvest. And it recalled God's care, especially during the wilderness wanderings. Again, that's in Leviticus 23. And together, these 3 feasts are telling a bigger story. A story that reminded God's people that they are part of a big history of what God is doing in the world, and it's a history into which they are invited to actively participate. So as we think about how our worship connects today with the worship God's people were commanded to bring in the Bible, I want to emphasize 4 things. The first one has to do with ceremonies. That ceremonies matter. And I think there's a cynical part of all of us, I feel it sometimes myself, that says, why does God care so much whether people get together to celebrate his work in the world? Why would he go so far even as to tell us exactly what he wants us to do, or some of the things that he wants us to do when we get together? And we see that here in these verses, right? Eat bread without yeast for 7 days. Why does God care to give that instruction so much? Why does he tell his people, make sure you don't come empty-handed? Why does it matter? How come we can't just worship God in our own way? You can imagine, I think, an ancient Israelite talking to his neighbor over the fence as one of these feasts is going to come. And the one guy says to the other, yeah, you know what, you go to the feast. I don't really need you. You go if that's what does it for you, but I'm going to stay here. I'm going to worship. I'm going to pray in my own backyard. It's a lot prettier here. And if I go to the temple, I go to the tabernacle, I have to deal with all those smelly, sweaty pilgrims and, that guy that always sings off key, in the back, It's just nicer to do it here. I think we all understand those ancient and somewhat contemporary excuses, right, for disengaging from communal worship. Because one of the realities about community is that it can be annoying sometimes. There are people that will rub us the wrong way in any community. Sometimes there's even people we like who hurt our feelings or kind of bother us. When we come to worship, there are things that we have to do here maybe that don't fill us all in the same way, that don't make us feel as good about what's going on here. Particularly in our modern individualistic culture, we cringe at the idea that worship should demand something of us other than what we personally want to bring to it. Or maybe even worship should demand anything of us at all, other than what we can get from it. One of the things that we have to understand about the Christian faith is that the Christian faith is about relationship with the living God. And in relationship, there's always an awareness of not just what's good for me, but what does the other person want? If I never thought about what Brandy and the kids liked to do, or their interests or abilities, I wouldn't have much of a relationship with them, would I? It might be kind of fun if they always did what I wanted. My daughter's laughing. But it wouldn't really be a relationship that I'm invested in. And the same is true in our relationship with God. There's times where we need to respond to what God is inviting us and telling us to do. And so ceremonies matter. There are some things that can only take place when we worship together. I stood over here this morning and talked about baptism. We have the Lord's table right in front. Sacraments are maybe the most obvious thing that we can only do when we get together. Though many people today see baptism primarily as a personal expression of choice and commitment to God, the church has often talked about it in terms of God's action towards us, God's promises to us, where God takes the initiative to incorporate us into his body, into his community. Same is true with the Lord's Supper. When we talk about being part of one loaf or sharing in the one cup, it's a little hard to understand fully what that means when we're sitting there at home just thinking about it. Singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs feels a little different when you're doing it alone, doesn't it? It can be worshipful, but it's not quite the same as doing it with God's people. Even Bible study or prayer, which are things that we can do alone, are different when we set them at the center of community life, as if to say, what is said in this book, the story that is told, is so important that really we can only fully understand it when we're trying to understand it together in community. Now, I realize ceremonies don't save us. We're not saved because we come here and go through the rituals and go through the motions of public worship. But ceremonies remind us of God's saving grace that we share in together. Just like the people ate unleavened bread together to remind them how they had to rush out of Egypt because God's salvation was coming so quickly and so dramatically in that moment of Passover. So things done in corporate worship remind us and testify to the world that God is forming a community in His grace, on His terms, out of His goodness. But it's not just ceremonies. Times matter too. The people of Israel are commanded to celebrate the Passover in the month of Aviv because it was at that time of the year that God brought them out of Egypt, verse 15 tells us. They celebrated the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year to remember that at the end of the year how God had richly provided for them yet again in the harvest. And we read verse 12. The whole section is set in the context of God's instructions a few verses earlier about the Sabbath day. And how there is this rhythm every single week of reminding one another, reminding ourselves that we rest in what God has done for us. Now there's a sense, of course, in which specific days and times really don't matter. In fact, Paul in Colossians 2 and again in Romans 14 warns against making too much out of days or seasons. He says, we can make these things kind of legalistic and we can look down on each other because we're not observing them exactly the same way we want, everybody's doing. Or the people around us aren't doing exactly what we're doing, and we can look down on them. There's nothing particularly holy about the spring season or especially spiritual about the late fall. No day of the week is somehow uniquely holy, as if something changes on in the character of that day as opposed to a day 2 days later. But again, we see how the community life of God's people brought them together to mark in specific ways at specific times the history of God's care and provision for them. That God's not just saying to them, well, show up on your time. When you can work it into your schedule, then think about me. But it demands attention on God's schedule. God worked at specific times in specific ways to make His saving grace known in public ways, and public worship at those times reflects something of that. And so since the earliest days, the church has gathered on the first day of the week. We see this pattern developing already in the New Testament, Acts 20, for example. Or 1 Corinthians 16 talks about the first day of the week. It is kind of just in passing. It's not a whole big treatise on how the church worshiped, but it's just mentioned in passing. Revelation, it's talking about the Lord's Day. In this way, Jesus' followers are keeping the practice of the ancient Jews and setting aside one day out of the week to remember that God provides everything that we need for body and soul so that we can rest in Him. But the church shifted its corporate life on the first day of the week rather than on the seventh day as the Jews did, because it was on that day, the first day, that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, every time we gather for worship here in the church, we are saying that the rhythm of our lives, the story that shapes our lives, that sits at the center of it, around which we are building our weeks, that story is the story of the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, the resurrection is not just something that we as Christians agree with in theory. We check that box and say, okay, I'm a Christian because I think that was true. No, we're saying that it's a story that we want to connect with in regularly scheduled public ways that say this event matters. Now again, I suppose we could say that any day is good to gather for worship, and we would be right in a sense. I could remember the resurrection on a Wednesday. It's just as true on a Wednesday as it is on a Sunday morning, isn't it? But I think kids know how this works, right? I could also pick any day of the year on which to celebrate your birthday, right? It wouldn't quite feel the same. If your birthday's in the winter and I pick a day in the middle of the summer and say, hey, you know what, we're going to celebrate your birthday that day, you'd say, well, this is great. I like cake and everything, and I like getting presents, but it's not my birthday. We're responding to a specific event, a historical event, and in the same way, the worship of the church is built around times because it celebrates the real history behind what God is doing. But it's not just ceremonies and times. We want to talk this morning, too, about how commitment matters. Going through this text, one of the interesting things we find in the middle of this section is this comment in verse 15. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. And if we read a little bit farther, I didn't go that far, but in verse 19, there's a similar instruction about make sure you bring the first fruits of your harvest of the soil to God. And both of these instructions about not coming empty-handed and bringing the first fruits are found in a variety of places in Scripture. They're both repeated in Exodus 34. One or the other is found in Deuteronomy 16, Numbers 18, Deuteronomy 18, Nehemiah chapter 10, Proverbs 3. If you want those references, I can give them to you later on. But my point is that these are things that God says over and over again. When you come, when you worship, when you are in relationship with me, there's some sort of an offering or a commitment or a first fruits. Not the leftovers for God, but a conscious bringing of the best. Well, I realize that money is a little bit of a sensitive subject in our society today, but the Bible is never shy in telling us that God has a claim on our resources. If we look at the Bible, we see that offerings are a crucial part of the worship of ancient Israel, and we see similar patterns developing in the early church as well. I mentioned 1 Corinthians 16 earlier. And in 1 Corinthians 16, one of the things that Paul says to the Corinthians is when you get together on the first day of the week, set aside some of your offerings. What's the significance of this? Why would God bother? Why would he care whether we bring something when we come? Well, the sacrifices, tithes, and gifts that are brought to God in the Bible remind the people of a couple of truths. First of all, sacrifices remind people that there's a price of sin. Sin has a cost. Redemption has a cost. Again, we talk about relationship. And the Bible is really an invitation for us to enter into relationship with the living God through Jesus Christ and only through Jesus Christ. Keeping a relationship alive has a cost. Sooner or later, I'm going to do something that offends you, or you're going to do something that offends me. And there's nothing, the sad thing about a sinful world is there is nothing that you or I can do to undo the effect of that sin, of that wrong that's done. Now, yes, there can be forgiveness, but if I say something rude to you, you might be a little leery about being around me for a while, because that is part of the relational cost of sin. The same is true in our relationship with God. And so the sacrifices were a way of reminding Israel that in order for forgiveness to happen, something had to be given up. A goat, a sheep, a dove, something had to be brought. And often life, we saw the death that came when we brought that offering. And of course, in the Bible, the great offering is the offering of Jesus for our salvation. That the Son of God had to die in order for us to get forgiveness. And so offerings keep the price of that in front of us. The Passover, the blood on the doorway reminded people that there was a price that was paid so that their firstborn could come out of Egypt. But secondly, offerings remind us that all blessings come from God too. The offerings of crops and first fruits signal to the people the gift of God's daily provision. But in a sense, even the sacrifices remind people that they can't get forgiveness unless God gives the means by which they get forgiveness, right? That goat or that bull or whatever it is you bring for your sin offering, the only way to get that, God gave it in the first place. The sacrifice of Jesus that we turn to for our salvation, how did that come? Only through God. I think it's good that God reminds us that worship requires an investment, not just because the church needs money to keep the lights on and get the paper to print bulletins and so on. No, the requirement of offerings recalls for us the cost of the story that we tell. It reminds us that the price of our redemption was the Son of God and the death of the Son of God. And compared to that, even the biggest check we could drop in the collection plate pales in comparison. But the offering also reminds us that we think it's worth the investment to tell the story of God's majesty and mercy. And so I want to challenge you this morning to keep that connection alive in your minds when you come to worship, to think to yourself as you pass the offering plates on the way in, wait a second, that's there to remind me of the price of salvation and the importance of commitment. And I know we have a lot of generous folks in this church, and I'm thankful for that. I want to encourage your continued open-handedness. But everyone can give something. This is not something that you only have to do, a connection that you make when you're further along in life and you're kind of financially stable. Kids can do this, right? You can bring a quarter a week, maybe a dime a week. But something on the way in to just say to yourself, no, you know what? This is something that God invites me into relationship with. I'm not paying him back. There's nothing I can do to pay God back for what he's done for me. But I can express in tangible ways that I'm committed, I'm invested in this story. And so we have ceremonies, and we have tithes, and we have commitment and offerings. Finally, we want to say that transcendence matters. We get to verse 17, and we find out what worship is really all about. 3 times a year, God says, Israel was to appear before the sovereign Lord. You are to appear before the sovereign Lord. In other words, don't just get together because it's a national holiday, although it is. And don't just go to the tabernacle to worship because you're going to get to see old friends from different parts of the country, although hopefully you get to do some of that. But be aware as you're coming in that this is an opportunity to encounter the living God. Jesus would say the same thing about gatherings later on. He would say that where 2 or 3 even are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. And although all of life belongs to God, and ancient Israel believed that just as much as we do, you could worship, you could pray, you could do those things anywhere. There is something essential about being a part of a gathering where the whole community is aware of the fact that we're telling a story of God's majesty and goodness and mercy. All those things are on display simply by the fact that we're getting together to talk about it. Public worship is a little like the difference between getting invited to watch a basketball practice and a basketball game. Community Life Ministry team could have decided that this week would be a great time to go watch Whitensville Christian's girls team practice, right? There's nothing wrong with watching somebody shoot free throws or run drills or laps or whatever it is that basketball coaches make their kids do these days. It's all good stuff. There's nothing wrong with personal devotions or prayer times around the dinner table or with service in the community. Those are things that we should be doing. But people come to watch the game. People come to watch us put it all together so that together we tell a story. This is what we are doing. This is what it's all about. Now, I realize the world may not be all that interested in what goes on inside walls like these on a Sunday morning. It's part of the argument for why church should get out of the 4 walls and into the world. But there's also a reminder in worship, I think, that we are not here just for the world, to benefit the world, but we are here for relationship with God. The very fact that there are enough people gathered here in a public way on a Sunday represents a call to the world and a commitment to tell the story of who God is. And I realize sometimes we feel this itch to get out of this building and go into the world and do something. It's a good itch. But there's also something to our being called out of the world and simply challenged to be before God, to hear his story, to remember his mercy, to offer humble gratitude for his provision. And those things are themselves more countercultural and more impactful than anything else we could be doing in this space of time on a Sunday morning as followers of Jesus. And it's because we gather to tell that story, we're reminded why it is that we do the stuff that we do when we get out of this building. And so I know that there's places with better coffee and more excitement, more interesting activities maybe on a Sunday morning, but there is nowhere other than the public worship of the church where we can be invited into the big story of what God is doing with and for his people in the resurrection of Jesus. And if you remember nothing else I said this morning, remember this: the reason we get together is to tell the story of Jesus. And there's nowhere else in the world where the story of Jesus will be on display in quite the same way as it is in the worship of the church. So how often do you need to come to church to be a faithful follower of Jesus? I know some of you are doing the math this morning. You're thinking to yourself, well, they said 3 times. That sounds pretty good. I can do that. I could probably even double that without thinking twice about it. But I think we should also remember the context. Many of these people didn't live anywhere near the sanctuary. More often, they lived 50 or even 100 miles away, and they didn't drive there, they walked. And they didn't come for an hour, hour and 15 minutes. They came for a week. Going to the annual festivals is a big project. And so I'll grant you, if you walked here from Springfield this morning, and you're planning to stay for the week until next week, Sunday, when you walk home again, then you probably got your time in. But I think what God's Spirit is communicating to us this morning is not about checking a box, saying, I put my time in, but saying, what kind of rhythm do you and I need to know that we're part of this story that connects us to the living God? Because for all the shortcomings of what we do here, something still happens on Sunday morning in worship. Something that reminds us who we are as beggars on God's mercy, as sinners in need of God's grace. Something we need to remind us who God is, as merciful and loving and good and gracious. Something that we can't live without, even if the people we worship with occasionally rub us the wrong way, or the pastor talks too fast or too long. I won't comment on that. Or the liturgy doesn't quite suit our tastes. A line that I had run across for last week's sermon struck with me this week too. That Jesus didn't come to give us a philosophy to live by. He came to call us into community with each other. So how often do we need this? As often as we need to remember the wonder of the resurrection. As often as we need to rest in God's care and provision for us. As often as we need to be still and know that He is God. As often as we need, in order to set aside our own preferences and our own self-centeredness and submit ourselves to the will and the glory of God. As much as is necessary for the people around us to clearly identify us as people who are connected to the story of whatever is being told in that church, the story of Jesus that's told each week. Yes, we can pray anywhere and sing anywhere and serve anywhere, and we should. But if we believe that relationship with God is something worth investing in, something significant, we'll have to think about times and ceremonies and investments and transcendence that recall the saving grace of a God who invested in us. A God who broke out of the tomb one Sunday morning so that every knee would bow and every tongue would confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And if we make a habit out of being together and worshiping together in community for Jesus' sake, I think we'll be surprised how often we discover that God was already here in this community, in His church, waiting for us. Let's pray.